That's what I was looking to do. And yeah, so we're super pumped to have Zachary on this morning. I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and then we can get started.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys for having me. I think this is the second one we've done with you guys, but yeah, no, it's a topic that a lot of real estate brokerages request to be talked to about. If I can share my screen here, we got a presentation. There we go. Perfect. Everyone can see this here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so we're gonna go into assignment transactions today, and specifically, we're gonna focus exactly what you as realtors need to know. Talking about a little bit about the actual legal distinctions. We're going to talk about actually drafting the assignment of the agreement of purchase and sale, which is essentially the document that you guys need to deal with when doing assignments. And then taxes, because most assignments deal with new construction and HST is applicable, and it can be very confusing. So these are the three areas that I find are where I get the most questions, and the area that most realtors actually need some guidance or just some tips on, how to do these properly, make sure you're protecting your client. So, let's start from the beginning. What is an assignment sale? So it's the transfer of a buyer's interest in an agreement of purchase and sale to a new buyer before the original closing date. So there's a key distinction that you have to make here. You're selling a contract, not a property. So traditional purchase and sale, what the seller has a property, selling it to the buyer is giving money in exchange for that. In this situation, you've got the assigner, who is both a buyer in the original contract and is also a seller in the assignment. So they're buying the property, or they have a contract to buy the property, and they're selling that right. Now, the fact that they're selling a right and not the property has a lot of far-reaching legal implications that can go into probably about 20 different areas of law on that, just that key distinction. But for our purposes, the main thing you want to remember is you're selling a right, not the property. Another one that trips people up. So as I speak, I'll use those terms: assigner, assignee. Try and remember these. Assigner is the seller. Assignee is the buyer. So there's some overall benefits of allowing assignment transactions, which, are an implication of legislation. So these are allowed in Ontario. And essentially what this does, the main thing, it allows for flexibility, right? So assignment transactions can offer a way out for buyers who, are not able to close anymore or no longer wish to. Again, it's mostly associated with new construction, right? A lot of times we've got multiple years between the original signing of the agreement of purchase and sale and the eventual closing. So life circumstances may change. Assignment offers a way out. Now, there's other situations where, markets increase, buyers want to take advantage of profits. The ability to assign allows them to avoid double transaction costs, right? If if the property value has gone up before closing and they do wish to sell that, they can sell the right directly, so assign the property rather than closing on the original agreement and then selling it to the buyer. So avoiding that second transaction cost. The funny thing about assignments, you kind of see them most prevalent in very good or very bad markets. Right, very bad markets, people are unable to close. On new construction, you're seeing more assignments. When things are really good, prices jumped. People are signing those contracts that they may have entered into a couple years before because there's a profit to be made. So the actual right to assign. So in resale, and when I say resale, I'm talking about using the standard OREO 100 form or the OREO 101 form. Assignment is already permitted. Sometimes I see clauses in Schedule A that say, the buyer has the right to assign this property. It's not actually necessary. That right to assign already exists. The only reason it wouldn't exist is if there's language added to the standard APS that specifically denies the right to assign it. So when we're dealing with resale, the assumption is assignment is allowed. Now, when we're dealing with new construction, it's a different story. As some of you will know, it's not common to see the ORIA forms on new construction. You're usually dealing with a much more comprehensive builder agreement of purchase and sale. And in these, assignment is almost always prohibited without the builder's consent. Now, builder's consent doesn't come free, and usually it doesn't come without stipulations. So typically they require an assignment fee. They may include legal fees. They always have an admin fee, which you have no idea where they pull these numbers out from. They also usually want some sort of approval on the assignee. And the most typical one is a mortgage approval by that assignee. So here's an example of what that prohibition clause would look like in a new construction agreement of purchase and sale. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but main things here, not allowed to assign his or her interests. The other one that's always interesting here is there's usually a prohibition on marketing that. So as you know, you're not allowed to assign it, you're not allowed to put it on the MLS or market it for sale. So that's the to list or advertise the unit for sale or lease. All of this is without the prior written consent of the vendor, which consent may be arbitrarily withheld. So they're saying that it doesn't have to be reasonable for any reason they decide. They could say, hey, you are not allowed to assign the property. And usually their consent correlates with market conditions. And it makes sense, right? If the builder still has units to sell and you say, hey, I'd like to assign my property, I want to list it on the MLS for assignment, they're most likely going to deny this because they're not going to want to compete with themselves. Now, if they have already sold out most of the project or the project is sold out, well, they're going to add some additional revenue from these assignment fees, right? And these assignment fees, which include this, like I said, very high admin fee, I've seen them range, $5,000 to $15,000, somewhere in that range. So a lot of money when it comes to that actual consignment consent. So another thing, just a side note, you want to keep that in mind when you're pricing an assignment, right? Because you have to figure out who's actually going to be paying that cost of consent when you're dealing with new construction. We'll get into that a little more. Drafting the assignment of APS. So this is a document. You're dealing with either ORIA Form 145 or ORIA Form 150. Really, the only difference here is what you're looking at. When you're looking at the assigner's interest in real property, you're dealing with this form. When it's not a condominium, you're dealing with this one when it is, right? Just a different way to describe the properties. Other than that, they're virtually identical. The strange thing about these ones, and I always start with Schedule B here, which is, not normal. Usually brokerages have their own Schedule Bs, things like that. The ORIA Form 145 and 150 have their own preset Schedule B. And this is typically where I like to start because this is where the problems usually happen. So this is kind of our assignment math, right? This shows the price of the actual assignment, the price of the original contract, and all the numbers in between, as well as it indicates timing of payments. So it can get complex. So we're going to actually go through and do one of these because I think it's helpful to actually see how it's done. And I'm going to show you where the most common mistake is because I'm going to say it's almost 50% of the time we see it done incorrectly. So just this is a zoom in of the same thing we're looking at. So this is a Schedule B on an assignment of an agreement of purchase and sale. So we're going to use some nice round numbers. We're going to keep it simple. Let's say we've got our assigner. So that's the person buying the new construction property and then assigning or selling that right. So let's say they paid $500,000. So our next thing we're going to look at is what did they actually sell this for? So let's say paid 500 for it. It's been a year. Property values have increased. They decide, hey, I want to sell this or I want to assign my property. So let's say the market has now gone up and people are willing to pay 600,000 for the same unit. So you list the property for them or you help them assign the property. You get a buyer willing to pay 600. That's where the actual purchase price of the assignment goes. So we've got our original purchase price. That goes in number 2. Again, I like to start there because that's kind of the start of the transaction. Number 1 is the purchase price that the assignee, so the new buyer, is willing to pay. So right there, you get your profit, right? Purchasing, or they have a right to purchase for 500. They're selling for 600. Now this line number 3, this is deposits paid by the assigner to the seller under the original agreement of purchase and sale. So usually to the builder, right? There's typically a deposit structure when you enter a new build contract. So let's say for argument's sake that so far in that first year, they paid $50,000 in deposits. This is important because this is where all the confusion now comes. So remember that $50,000 that's paid as a deposit. If that buyer, the original buyer, so the assigner, when they assign the property, that deposit doesn't come back to them. That stays attached to the property, which means it's actually the assignee getting credit. So again, you'll see this all come together. So now we have to figure out number 4, payment by assignee to assigner for this agreement. So again, we look back here. This is deposit paid by assigner to the seller under the agreement of purchase and sale indicated in Schedule C. Side note, whenever it's written like this, and it is many times throughout these forms, the original agreement of purchase and sale as indicated in Schedule C, that's the original agreement that's being assigned. It's always attached to Schedule C here. This last line is what's important. To be paid by the assignee to the assigner as follows. So this means that this is reimbursable. Now, there are some situations where this might be 0 and the assigner in a bad market may be eating that deposit. But let's say market's gone up, so they want to be reimbursed for that credit that the assignee is going to get. So when we're filling out number 4 here, this is where all the mistakes happen right here. Most people just take the profit, right? Because it's read, or you read it as payment by assignee to assigner for this assignment agreement. Well, if this is a total purchase price and this is what they have to pay, most people write $100,000 here. The problem is that doesn't account for the reimbursement of the deposit. So when you're filling out number 4 here, the simple formula is 1 minus 2 plus 3. So 600 minus 500 is $100,000 plus the 50. That gets us $150,000. This is the actual payment that needs to be made for the assignment, right? It's $100,000. That's the difference between the two contracts. But remember, once they become the assignee, they don't have to pay $500 for the property. There's already been $50,000 in deposits paid. So they only have to pay $450. So in order to make this all work, it's $150,000 that has to be paid to the assigner. So number 5 is more simple. Most people get this correct. This is the deposit on the assignment. So forget the original contract for a second. Let's say we assign the property. We have $100,000 profit here. So essentially the person's paying $100,000 premium to buy this contract. And in the course of negotiating that deal, you said, okay, there's a deposit payable, same way as a resale condominium or resale house. You're going to have a deposit payable within 24 hours upon acceptance. And let's say in this situation, it's $20,000. So when you're figuring out number 6 is also usually done incorrectly, but only by virtue of number 4 being done incorrectly, because this is that math. 150 minus 20,000. So the balance of the payment for the assignment agreement is $130,000. I'm going to stop right here. Let's start with any questions, because this is where things get confusing. Instead of jumping back while we're in on the math, is there anything that's throwing anybody off? Did I go through it too quickly?
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Speaking about development, you explained that any property can be assigned. And speaking about resale property, and that even if it doesn't say in the offer, somebody can assign it before the closing, right?
Mhm.
Okay, then the question is, when one person buys from the other person, which does not involve the corporation, we usually put into the offer HST included, because people understand that it's most likely it's not subject to HST. But if, let's say, the buyer signed it to the corporation and prior to closing, then it may be subject to HST. That's what happens then.
Well, in that situation, if it's still a resale property, that's what determines the HST. So if it's a used residential property, then HST doesn't need to be included. And even if it's written included in, the clause has to do with if HST is applicable. So in that case, it still wouldn't be changed regardless of who the buyer is.
So does that mean that still the seller does not pay HST?
No, in that situation, the seller wouldn't pay HST.
I have a quick question, and I may be jumping ahead. Are you going to show us this math if a property is at a loss?
I didn't do an example for that,
Okay.
but let me see if I can think of it in my head here. So if we're doing, let's try and work through one, bear with me here. Let's say this number here is $400,000. That would be a big loss. And let's keep the deposit repayment the same. So we're saying that the buyer is going to, or the assignee is going to pay $100,000 less for this. So if we had 400 there, the only number that would change on 1, 2, and 3 is that number right there. So 400. So we'd still have that reimbursement of deposit. So essentially, we would have payment by the assignee to this, payment by the assignee to the assigner for this agreement. We'd have $100,000 swing on that. So essentially, the assignor would be paying the assignee $50,000 to take that contract. I haven't seen one that's severe. I've seen the most I've seen is just in terms of deals we've actually executed, is where these were the same and that number was not being recompensated. So essentially, the credit was any deposits already paid, the assignee was getting credit for.
I don't think the swing is 100,000. The swing is 200,
Yeah, sorry, you're
So
right.
it would be
200,000
it
instead
would
of
be minus
150.
50,000 then.
Yeah, so the $50,000 is paid by the assignor. Yes, so you're right. Sorry, a $200,000 swing. This would be negative 50.
I have a quick question going back to the assignment terms and any ability to negotiate that. For example, I know when I was working on landlord sides in commercial, we'd get, the assignment clauses or subleasing clauses, and there'd be some flexibility on being able to negotiate. For example, if someone was representing a tenant, or in this case, the assignee, or not assignee at the time, it would be whoever's initially entering into that deal with the builder, so the buyer. And it said, you cannot, or they can unreasonably withhold the ability to allow somebody to assign, right? Is there any negotiating power or anything that can be done when you're entering into those deals with the builders?
Absolutely. Usually there's a period where the contract is subject to lawyer review.
Mhm.
Depending on market conditions, this can be negotiated. And I've seen that in the right conditions more often. Like this would be more of a market where, builders are more flexible to things. They're not selling as much. The leverage is more towards the buyer. So, if a buyer comes in and says, yeah, but I want to change this assignment. I want the right to assign it, the right to list it, possibly the even reduction of all fees. And that's the most common one we see is the fees. So
Wow.
it's usually granting the right to assign, whether it's allowed in the MLS, that goes back and forth depending on where the builder's at on sales. But yeah, in a lot of situations, you can actually reduce that fee. So again, that's where it goes back to market conditions and negotiation leverage.
Mhm.
Where is the market at that point? But yeah, everything in a like a new construction contract is negotiable as well. They do have their standard template, but it's still contract.
Mhm.
We can change that. We can enter into it. It just depends on the builder and how flexible they're willing to be. And that all stems from demand.
And generally speaking, this is a market that we have more leverage in terms of negotiating those
A buyer's
terms.
got more negotiating power right now. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, the final thing before we move on from Schedule B here, the other most common mistake is this line right here. And it's kind of confusing because some people don't read read it closely enough to understand it, where it almost looks like it's a dividing line in some cases. This line has to be filled out. And what this is stipulating is that reimbursement deposit. So the reimbursement of the original deposit paid by the assigner. This is stipulating when this is to be paid. So most common scenario I see is this first one. So it's upon acceptance of this agreement and receipt of consent to assign from the original seller. So think about new construction, that consent still has to be obtained, usually has to do with that mortgage approval. So first you execute the assignment of APS, it gets sent to the builder. If they consent, then this amount becomes due. So we're going to get into the timing of payments on the next section, but I just want to make sure The other thing we remember is filling out this on number 3. That's all part of one thing. That's almost why it's indented here, because if it was just a dividing line, it would be all the way over here. Just remember that needs to be filled out. I see way too many where they come in blank. It's an important term of the contract. So we're going to stay with our same example. We're going to talk about the timing of payments. So first one, upon acceptance. Again, it doesn't have to be upon acceptance, just like any agreement of purchase and sale you guys have done. You can change that if you want to, but the most common one is deposit due upon acceptance, 24 hours, right? So let's say signer sells to the assignee here, $20,000 deposit based on this contract. So that's paid first. That's held in the brokerage trust account, listing brokerage. The second one, based on our situation here or based on our example, would be the reimbursement of the original deposit. So it's upon acceptance of this assignment and receipt of consent to assign from the original seller. So let's say they brought it back, or you brought it to the builder as the assigner. The signer says, yeah, we approve the assignee. That means the $50,000 is now due from the assignee to the assigner for the contract. So it leaves the balance of the payment for this agreement. So the balance is typically due on closing. It says prior to the completion of the agreement of purchase and sale contemplated in Schedule C. So it's got to be paid prior to completion on the original contract. So usually that's the final closing date when we're talking about new construction condominiums. Now, in this case, this will be your third payment. But remember, the way we've set up this example, it's not going to be $130,000, right? 150 is our total payments, profit plus reimbursement of deposit. $20,000 was paid on the original deposit, so that brings us down to the 130. But remember, because we've written in the deposit or the reimbursement deposit payment with this term, this was already paid when consent was received. So that number becomes 80. You don't actually have to change it on Schedule B. This is just for the example. This would mean what the balance is due on closing. Again, we as lawyers would be the ones finalizing those numbers anyways, but it would be the $80,000 that's finally paid. The clause reads, and I'm going to show you the clause in Schedule A, essentially the balance, a clause that you guys all add in resale contracts. It's pre-done in the Schedule A here. It says prior to, but it usually still means same day in practice, right? It just has to be paid before actually closing on the new construction. Any questions with any of that? Perfect. Let's talk about HST. So when a builder advertises price, it usually says our price includes the HST. So this is the price with the HST. Now, what's lesser known, or where I see a lot of confusion, is the HST rebate. So there's some funky math with it, but it's roughly around 400 and something thousand. But anything over that, you get the maximum provincial rebate of HST. That's $24,000. So when you're dealing with this, most people take that purchase price with the HST, and then they'll say, oh, well, I get the HST rebate too. So minus $24,000 from that. While builders actually advertise it with or already including that HST rebate. So when they put the purchase price on the APS with HST, the true purchase price is actually $589, right? Because this $24,000 is already being taken into account. And they do that by stipulating in the builder agreement of purchase and sale that number one, you're eligible for the HST rebate, and you've agreed to give it to the buyer or to, assign it to the buyer. And there's paperwork that we do to make sure that happens. And then what they do is they give you credit for it. So they take that with this, which is the true number, and they show you this price, $565. So again, that confusion is most people think, oh, if I'm getting the HST rebate, I get $24,000 off of that purchase price. No, in most cases, it's already included. Now, again, every builder can do it their own way. So this isn't an absolute truth. This is just the most common situation we see. So when you're dealing with the actual assignment, builders will often deny the HST rebate. Now, it doesn't mean that the assignee or the new person is not getting the HST rebate, because if they qualify for it, they can still get it. It means they're no longer doing it the way the original agreement of purchase and sale contemplates it. Like I said, the original agreement usually says, we're going to take the $24,000. You're going to assign that rebate to us. We're going to take it off. This is your nice purchase price. The reason they do this is because a lot of times assignments take place after occupancy. One of the requirements of the HST rebate is no one having lived in the property. Because they can't guarantee this and that's a risk for them, they say you got to handle the rebate by yourself. We're not giving you the credit anymore. You pay it, and then you go through the reimbursement process yourself with the provincial government. That means that the purchase price is usually $24,000 more. So again, it's something to keep in mind because that's not mortgage money. That's something that has to come out of the pocket of the assignee.
So
So
does
again,
the schedule,
something to be aware of. Go
sorry,
ahead.
does the Schedule B has to be adjusted then, the original purchase price?
Yeah, so this is all done and you'll see that on the statement of adjustments.
Okay.
But remember, the purchase price still stays the same. It's because by virtue of the contract, there was this credit of the HST rebate. And then you see statement of adjustments for new construction deals are quite difficult. But again, that's mostly dealt with on the lawyer's side. But this is where that credit gets taken away. And again, the buyer or the assignee will still get that rebate. So that purchase price is still technically the same. It just has to be paid up front and then reimbursed through the government. So you apply on your own. Does take much longer, obviously. So I think the latest things we're seeing around 3 months for reimbursement. But so again, that's something that a buyer or assignee in this situation should be aware of. So this is just a general table. Now it's an example of a common new construction setup. So again, it's not an absolute. These can all be changed by virtue of contract, or most of them can be. But this just gives you an idea of the fees that both the assignor, so the seller of the contract, and the assignee would be payable. So I'm going to just touch briefly on the first two for the assigner because it's more of a tax law and accounting issue. But we've got new rules regarding HST and the profits on assignments in the last couple of years. So when there is HST applicable to a property and there's profit on it, the assignor, so the person making that profit, has to pay HST to the government on that. That applies to new construction condos. Again, I'm not a tax lawyer in itself, so it's not my area where I specialize in, but that's the general idea of it. There's obviously certain situations that could change this or potentially alter it. Income tax on the profit. So again, instead of being capital gain, the anti-flipping tax, again, not exactly my area, but my understanding of it is because you're not actually taking possession of the property or legal title, you haven't owned the property for 12 months. And according to the new anti-flipping tax or anti-flipping rules, according to the CRA that came in beginning of 2023, that's now treated fully as income tax. So instead of taking just 50% of the profit and that being added as capital gain tax, you're paying income tax on 100% of the profit. Cost of builder consent, usually that's paid by the assigner, but again, that's just more virtue of practicality. If you want to talk about theory, theoretically, it's built into the price that they're selling to the assignee, right? They know they have to pay this, so they're going to, if it's $5,000 that they have to pay, that $5,000 being built in the same way, you or a buyer in real estate is still technically paying commission, it's built into the price. The last thing is assigner legal fees. Now, one thing to keep in mind, legal fees when it comes to assignments are usually more expensive. Just for example, my office, we charge, like if we're selling, we charge our standard sale price plus $1,000 if we're dealing with assignment. That's because there's more things that can go wrong. There's more paperwork attached to it. And these transactions get a lot messier. So just bear that in mind, especially with talking with clients. Legal fees are typically more expensive. Same thing on the assignee, and I know a lot of lawyers do a very similar situation. Again, it's our standard purchase price plus $1,000 when dealing with an assignment. So when you're on the assignee side, you're talking about that HST rebate payment. That's got to be paid up front. Now, again, it can be reimbursed if the assignee qualifies for the HST rebate payment, but remember, a lot of times that's built into the price. The other thing they're paying is land transfer tax. Now, land transfer tax was never paid by the original assigner because they never actually closed. It's not paid on the original execution of the assignment agreement. It's paid on final closing by the assignee. The assignee usually undertakes to pay all the adjustments under the original agreement of purchase and sale. Right, new construction has multiple adjustment changes in pricing from, the 4 years when the agreement was set up and the final closing because things change. And that's all subject to the agreement of purchase and sale by the builder. And again, the last thing, assignee legal fees. Quick one on land transfer tax. So who pays it? Again, the assignee pays the land transfer tax at closing, not at the time of the assignment or the execution of the assignment. There's nothing due. It's when they finally close on the property or the agreement of purchase and sale contemplated in Schedule C. So that the original contract that's being assigned. What is the land transfer tax based on? Technically, it's based on the original purchase price, the net amount. So what you do, you take the nice purchase price in the agreement of purchase and sale. So let's say that was at 565, add 24,000 divided by 1.13. That's generally the number you're going to get. I believe my math is right on that. And so you're paying, remember, land transfer tax is based on consideration. So you take the net amount. So you're not paying land transfer tax on the tax or the HST. You pay land transfer tax on the net amount and the consideration for the assignment fee. So usually that profit. So in our case, it would be the 565 plus 24 divided by 1.13 and then add 100,000. And that's your total consideration. That's what the buyer is going to be paying land transfer tax on. So if you forget everything we had in this presentation, try to remember 3 things. The right to assign. Resale, it's allowed unless prohibited. New construction requires builder consent. When you're doing Schedule B, when you're drafting an assignment of the agreement of purchase and sale, triple check your math. Remember, it's not common, so just keep that in your brain that, I have to make sure I take my time and do this correctly. Number 4 is often done incorrectly. And don't forget to actually fill out the timing of the payment on number 3. And last thing, remember the advertised price usually includes that HST rebate. So again, we always see a lot of confusion when realtors enter an assignment agreement, especially if it's their first time. They've talked to their client, and all of a sudden the client is surprised to find out that this is how that actually operates. So make sure there's an understanding of that. I always include my contact information at the end. Whenever you guys have questions, I know some of you already do reach out when you do need, some quick advice or just, some explanation of a situation. And of course, I write a realtor newsletter every Friday. I try and write about one thing that as a realtor you'd want to know. Remember, I've been in your shoes. I worked as a broker for 7 years. So there's a lot of things that I know, when I've been on that side of the transaction that I wish I either had access to or wish I would have known. So I try and keep that in mind. Every week I write about one thing. I try and keep it nice and short, just a couple minute read, and make sure you get one thing practically out of it. So if you're not already subscribed, and again, I know a lot of you are, that's a QR code. You can scan that and you can subscribe to the newsletter. So I think I see the chat going, so I'm going to check some questions.
So amazing. If you guys have any other questions, just put up your hand or pop it in the chat while we still have Zachary with us, and then we can ask. And then otherwise, like you said, really recommend subscribing to his newsletter. And Mary, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Zachary. I just had one question. Who does the assignee pay the HST rebate back to? Is that the builder or the government?
Well, it's just no longer reduced from the purchase price. So that means it's being paid to the builder, but then they're applying with the provincial government to get that $24,000 back. Again, if they're get the maximum rebate.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Anna, just go ahead. I'm not sure.
Sorry, I wasn't sure how to put the hand up. Good morning.
Okay.
Quick question. When do you incorporate the commission paid to, like, so for the assignee, when you have an agent or assignor, when do you incorporate and how do you process the commission payable to us? And when is it payable?
It depends on the contract, actually. So it's a really good question, and it's something I didn't dive deep into. But if you notice, the assignment of the agreement of purchase and sale doesn't have its own completion date, and that's because it really shouldn't. right? The original agreement contemplates when the final closing is. Technically, an assignment is closed when all rights and obligations are fulfilled. So again, you can alter a lot of the timing of the payment. So in some situations, you can have the entirety of the payment, the original deposit of the assignment, the reimbursement of the deposit paid by the assigner, and the profit or the lift, all paid prior to final closing, right? There's more risk, obviously, for the assignee if the building never ends up getting finished. But that being set aside, if that's all done, then technically the assignment is closed. So as realtors, you guys are contemplating, okay, well, when do I actually get paid if I structure one of these deals? That can be contracted in. So a lot of times we see people writing in a closing date, and I hate that because again, just by the theory of these, there shouldn't be a closing date in the assignment. It's when everything's completed. So how I would write it, and contact me individually if you're ever in this situation and need it, and I can help you make sure you have the right clause. But essentially something that stipulates, okay, this is when all payments are due. This is a direction to the lawyers to release all funds, including commissions payable, to the real estate brokerages on whatever day or at this time. So again, it can be stipulated. You got to be very careful in writing that contract. So I always recommend talking to your broker of record or talking to a real estate lawyer to get the right wording and make sure it's drafted correctly in accordance with whatever whatever the structure of the assignment you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Brad, do you have your hand up?
Yep. Hey, sorry, just a quick question. How do you nail down that builder consent fee? Is that part of the original purchase agreement, or is that something you've got to seek after the fact?
Well, in theory, it could be negotiated at any time. Typically, we see it negotiated by the original buyer. So again, if they have leverage when they're doing that initial review, that might be one of the things they say, hey, can we reduce this fee or can we eliminate this fee? Can we change this clause? In some situations, I've seen where, we came to a builder and said, the original buyer can't close. They want to assign it. They're in a tough financial situation. And based on that one, which not to say this is how they all work, they waived the fee in that situation. So in theory, it could be negotiated at any point. Most typically, though, it's done at the start.
By a lawyer, by an agent?
Can be done by either. I can't say for sure because I only see it when it comes to my end. So I can't say whether it's more commonly done by the realtors or lawyers. I see it seldomly when we have a chance to actually negotiate the agreement before entering into it.
Thank you.
Amazing.
I have a
Any
quick
other
question.
questions? Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, and it's look, I don't know how often this would come up. I don't know what I don't know because I haven't really dealt with this. But if you're looking at a mixed-use development that has some commercial on the ground floor and the rest are whatever, the condos, and from a commercial perspective, does the builder, say you're representing the original buyer, commercial buyer that's buying the commercial ground floor property, and we go through the same exact situation and they're in no longer a position where they're going to be, or they want to sell for whatever reason prior to the original closing. So it's an assignment in theory. Now, when it comes to the consent that you are, that the builders have in that original contract with that buyer, are they more scrutinized in terms of being able to assign in the first place due to them wanting to focus on having a certain commercial clientele? So being able to, if a Tim Hortons goes in and buys franchise, it can't just sell to a coffee time or a weed shop or anything. Do you find that those are more particular?
Yeah, it's tough for me to say. I mean, the theory answer is, well, it's just going to depend on the type of product. So if that's a concern for the commercial seller of a construction or a commercial unit, then they're going to be more conscious to withhold that, or they would have a similar clause as the residential actually that says they're able to arbitrarily withhold consent, meaning that if it doesn't fit what their ultimate profile is, then they're going to deny any assignment. So there'll probably be something similar in that the seller or the original seller builder has full rights to deny the potential assignee. So either the original person has to close, or if they can't close, traditional remedies on breach of contract, or if they can find somebody suitable. So again, I don't deal with much commercial. Our practice is primarily focused on residential real estate, but just based on that, it's most likely going to be a contract where the original seller or the builder has full rights to determine whether an assignee is allowed.
Okay, thanks.
Amazing. Do we have any other questions? So good. Zachary, thank you so much for gifting us your time this morning. This was super informative and absolutely amazing. We really, really appreciate it. We're going to be sharing Zachary's information with all of you and a replay of the seminar this morning, so that way you can rewatch it and just ingrain it in your brains. And and otherwise, we'll have you guys all back next week for the next Feature Friday. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.